A generation of young men had been lost to the First World War. At the beginning, men had rushed to enlist. But as word spread of the horrendous slaughter, enlistments fell. To replace the dead and wounded, the Canadian government brought in conscription. The result was a bitter division between British Canada and French Canada that has never completely healed.
The Canadian Expeditionary Force was organized in August of 1914. Enthusiastically across the country, crowds had come out as the war began. Crowds came out everywhere in Europe too, but in Canada there was great enthusiasm. The former Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, said proudly in the House of Commons that when Britain's call goes forth, Canada's answer is the traditional British reply, ready, aye, ready, and people applauded and were absolutely excited by it. Over time, the notion of going to fight for Britain became more and more divisive. French Canadians really, well, they were keen on the war at the outset. It was exciting, it was new, something should be done. They had no enthusiasm for going themselves. They didn't see any identification with Britain, obviously, nor much with the Third Republic of France.
Towards the end of the war, the imposition of conscription, and how these kids were conscripted, they were conscripted by Protestant ministers, for God's sake, There was no, they were asked to take off their clothes, and they had never done that, even in front of their mothers, So consequently, they were a tremendous assault to their dignity. And the end result was that eventually the kettle boiled over, and it developed into riots that took place in Quebec City, for instance, if I remember correctly. But it did not degenerate into a quasi-civil war even, The sense of authority, the belief in authority, obedience to authority had a lot to do with it. I have no doubt the presence of Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the calming of those spirits. But there was a sense, but there remained after the war, this kind of a spirit, encore une fois, one more time, And they were told that if they didn't behave, they'll conquer them again.
British Canadians felt quite differently. They had two loyalties, to Canada somewhat, and to Britain by education, experience, and very often by connections. And 500,000 young Canadians out of a population of 8 million volunteered to go to the war.
Canada's contribution in manpower was enormous in relation to its population, and its frontline men gained a fearsome reputation as shock troops.
Canada started its involvement in the First World War essentially with the Second Battle of Ypres, which was in April 1915. The 1st Canadian Division was hooked into the British Army and received the brunt of one of the first German major gas attacks on the Western Front. It performed remarkably well. It suffered 2,000 casualties, but it held the line, and it sort of established the reputation which would follow on for the rest of the Canadian Corps throughout the war.
Canadian troops were often shunted back and forth at night. If they were detected in the line on a section of the front, it was a certain signal to the Germans of an attack. By the war's end, the Canadian Corps, 4 divisions strong, repeatedly drove in the German lines. This period is remembered as Canada's 100 days. By the end of the war, 56,000 Canadians had died in battle, with 190,000 wounded. More than half of the 420,000 who'd served overseas became casualties.
This was a war not of truth and duty and valor, as was sort of romanticized in the British papers, but one more of stealth and raw courage and deceit. It was a infantryman's war. It was a gunner's war. It was a sapper's war. It was a war of barbed wire, of railway lines, of artillery and endless shelling. It was a war where unlike the concepts of modern-day aspects where we see our enemy through a camera scope, these men were fighting in hand-to-hand conditions with bayonets, clubs, and their bare hands. It was well beyond the scope of perhaps what we can perceive today.
Had Private David Gillan died in battle, his family would have grieved, but would nonetheless have felt a measure of pride for his manner of dying. Instead, the Gillans have tried for 80 years to discover how he died and who killed him. For many years, All they knew came from a newspaper.
There were three brothers. John was the eldest, David, and then my papa, my father's father, Robert. And how Papa tells the story about how the family found out is like this. He was sent to the post office in Sydney Mines to get the paper. His mother, whom he calls mother very formally all the time, had sent him like she did every day. And he went in and he said, "Mr. McLean, my mother sent me for the paper." And the first thing was, Mr. McLean said, "There's no paper today. I'm sorry, Bob, no paper today." And Bob said, "Mr. McLean, if I don't go home with that paper, my mother's going to shoot me." And he said, I'm sorry, Bob, no paper." So he goes out, and here on the steps is this guy named Kenny Mackenzie reading the paper. So Papa turns around, he goes back, and he says, "Mr. McLean, if I don't go home with that paper, my mother will shoot me." So he got the paper, and he went outside, and he says, "I looked at it, and I saw the headline, Cape Breton Highlander killed in riot. And I read it down, and I saw my brother's name." He said, "I was just a little fella. I didn't know what to do. My father was down the mine, working." He said he had a reefer jacket, something called a reefer jacket, and the pocket was all tore up, he says. And he rolled up the paper, and he shoved it down. And he went home, and he told his mother, "There's no paper today." And she saw that there was something in his pocket. She gave him a shove, and she said, "What's that in your pocket?" And he pulled it out, and he says she read it, and she just collapsed. I think the fact that David died where he did, killed by his own, not on the Western Front, killed by the enemy, is a tragic satire. You have to appreciate the satirical part, as painful as it is, because you want to see him as having died honorably, which he did, and it is a great tragedy. But I think you have to see the satirical side of it, and it points a huge question mark, a pointed question mark, at all war.
There were many causes for the riot at Kinmel Park. Soldiers put up with the cold, isolation, lack of pay and shortage of blankets, but they would not accept the Army's failure to ship them swiftly home.
The British and the Canadians took the decision to have Canadian troops brought back to Britain to be held for a little while close to Liverpool, the main transatlantic port, and then to be shipped back in troop ships to Canada. The problem was they didn't necessarily have the appropriate shipping, so they used rust buckets like the Northland, which was almost like one of the old coffin ships, to ship the troops back. And there was a furore in Canada. How dare our veterans come back on ships that are falling apart without being properly fed, that are overcrowded, unsafe, with the officers on the deck and the men down below? How dare this happen? There was hell to pay in the Canadian Parliament over this.
Following the uproar, passenger accommodation on ships had to be reduced so Canadian troops wouldn't be overcrowded on the way home. That meant more delays. Many soldiers wondered what they were still doing in Britain when they could have sailed directly from French and Belgian ports.
If the Canadian soldiers had been asked, that's exactly what they wanted to do. They'd have shipped across the Atlantic on a shingle, I think, if they could have managed it. They wanted to go home. But of course, going home for many of them was to go to Britain. Remember I said half of the Canadians in the Canadian Corps at the end of the war had British ancestry, British roots. They'd been born there. Now, they had families in Canada, many of them. Some didn't. Some had families in England. But it seemed sensible to repatriate the Canadians through England to British seaports, allowing the Americans to dominate and the Atlantic seaports in France. The Americans had arrived. They had a lot of leverage. They had a lot of influence, and they were going to, as usual with Americans, have their own way. So it seemed sensible to use British Atlantic ports.
The men resented the continued military discipline and red tape. Ottawa insisted they do all their own paperwork before boarding a ship. That meant filling out 30 documents, answering 363 questions, collecting 8 signatures. Officers paraded them twice daily and drove them on pointless route marches. They received just enough pay for expenses on board ship. If they weren't shipped out, they had no money for cigarettes, beer, or even soap. Sir Arthur Currie, commanding officer of the Canadian Corps, dreamt of a big homecoming parade. He decided to keep the 3rd Division intact and send its battalions home as close together as possible. 5 ships allocated to Kinmel Park were turned over to the 3rd Division.
The 3rd Division had suffered heavier casualties in the 100 days than any of the other divisions. It had traditionally been perhaps the best of the 4 divisions, owing to a series of good commanders, but now it was in serious difficulties. And it was filled with MSA men, to use the correct official title for conscripts, Military Service Act men. It was kept in Belgium with the 4th Division, and then it was filtered back through England. And as it happened, in March of 1919, it was taking ship at Liverpool. The men at Kinmel, not far away in North Wales, reading Liverpool newspapers, seeing the Lord Mayor of Liverpool and other such people being cited as saying our fine gallant Canadians going home after their heroic sacrifices, are, to put it mildly, guffawing at the notion of these green conscripts being described as heroic fighters, but even more, that they're going home when men who have been in this miserable country of England and over in France, lo these many years, are still stuck in this God-forsaken hole in North Wales.
One of General Currie's goals in keeping units intact was the maintenance of discipline, but the soldiers had had their fill of discipline, and the wartime cohesion of the Canadian Corps was a thing of the past. In January 1919, a small race riot occurred at Kinmel Park when a sergeant in a construction battalion of black Canadians tried to arrest a white soldier for insolence. The black soldiers were on shower parade and had their razors at hand.
But it was simply a camp, like many others in England, where drafts were being collected. Didn't know their officers didn't know them, neither of them wanted to get to know each other very much better, thank you very much. They were just waiting to go home. They'd spent their pay, more pay was being withheld from them so they wouldn't waste all their money and arrive home penniless after the war. Again, a sensible thing to do. Why should you let men drink themselves crazy just because they're bored and arrive home flat broke when, after all, they would have a nice half-year saving to do something with their families? Very sensible, prudent, paternalistic kind of solution, but not welcome to the soldiers, who were busy gambling as soldiers do and drinking as soldiers do, and anxious not to be stopped.
In their huts, sorted according to their home military district, the men's grumbling grew more intense. Demobilizing soldiers were an unknown quantity. They'd been trained to kill, and with millions of others they were being returned to a civilian world ablaze with social unrest. Governments everywhere saw the spectre of the Bolshevik looming.
Governments were very, very concerned, across Europe, indeed across the Western world, governments were concerned that there was the great revolutionary tide had finally come. There was a great panic. The British cabinet in that period actually seriously discussed military options that they might wish to engage in should there be a revolutionary strike.
French troops had mutinied and suffered the Roman penalty of decimation. A mutiny by German naval ratings heralded the sudden German collapse. With the end of the war, British and Canadian troops were now defying their officers.
Let's not forget, these people are also very close to Liverpool, which at that time was one of the world's great cities. And that great city was involved in the most desperate series of conflicts in 1919. They blow up actually later, but one can see the city getting into that position of crisis, which leads to mass rioting, troops on the streets, gunboats in the Mersey, and that is just across the bay from Kinmel Bay.
It was the darkest day in British military history.
We're talking about 40,000 wounded in these trenches, another 20,000 dead.
The Battle of the Somme, A story of extraordinary courage mixed with colossal failure.
He was going to have them walk slowly towards the enemy. Now that seems really stupid.
The Somme, a special Armistice Day program at 6 o'clock tonight on the History Channel.
Can we still drive our cars and have cleaner air? We think so. Today, BP is improving air quality in 50 major cities around the world and across the UK by introducing cleaner burning petrol and diesel fuels. It's not an end to the problem, but the solution has to start somewhere. BP.
Frustrating, isn't it? When you need an any-purpose loan but don't know who to talk to about unlocking the capital tied up in your property. Even if you're self-employed, consider yourself to have a low credit rating, divorced, or retired. Don't worry, because Ocean Finance hold the key. Call 0800 858 858 and Ocean could help you. Ocean loans can be used for any purpose, and all circumstances will be considered. You may wish to improve your home, or buy a newer car, or simply consolidate all your existing debts into just one manageable monthly payment. There are no interviews, no arrangement fees, and no salesperson will call. So for that homeowner loan, call now. You'll be under no obligation, and you could secure the loan you need. Call Ocean Finance now on 0800 858 858. That's 0800 858 858.
With new Pay-As-You-Talk Smart Step from Vodafone, the more you say, the less you pay. Because the first 3 minutes you use your phone cost 25p each. Then for the rest of that day, it's just 5p a minute flat rate. Which means there are no more peaks.
Glad that's straightened out.
Low-cost calls day or night with new Pay-As-You-Talk Smart Step from Vodafone.
Hello? Yo, who's that? Yo, it's D.
True.
Hello? Yo, it's T.
True.
At PC World, people really do count. Because more people shop with us, we can have more people to help you. We've PC clinics in every store for advice, upgrades, and our complete PC health checks to keep your PC in peak condition for life. And we're still stamping down on prices. Before and after you buy, you can count on us.
Where in the world? PC World.
March the 4th, 1919. Camp bulletin boards again showed that not a single ship had been assigned for the men at Kinmel Park. When an officer tried to order his company out on a route march that morning, soldiers in the rear rank shouted, "Stand pat." Not a man moved. The camp CO, Colonel Cahoon, ordered his adjutant, Colonel Thackeray, to London with an urgent appeal for ships for the men under his command. Thackeray, he said, was to stay in London until ships were assigned. Thackeray was told 2 ships might be available on March the 15th. He didn't immediately telephone the news, but sometime later sent a telegram before going out for the night. But the telegram was not read at Kinmel until the following morning, by which time it was too late. Tensions at Kinmel Park reached boiling point on the night of March the 4th. After dark, some men broke into a canteen, then swept out of the camp to an adjoining area known as Tin Town, tin-roofed shacks, small stores catering to soldiers. Kinmel Park's Tin Town had a barber, an ice cream parlor, and a general shop. Once in the heart of the camp, it was moved because of friction between the shopkeepers and the soldiers, who felt they were being overcharged because they were a captive clientele. Canadian soldiers were well paid by English standards, but the men in Kinmel Park were broke, having received their last pay in anticipation that they'd be going home. That night, they took what they couldn't buy and destroyed Tin Town in the process.
The Tin Town phenomenon is part of commercial life at its most raw. There's your customers, they have money, pay night is Friday, raise the prices and get what you can out of them. The war is over and we haven't got many more months to get money from them, do your best. The soldiers are saying, they're our exploiters, they're the enemy. Tin towns were common in British camps before, during, and probably to the present day in one form or another. I hear they exist around UN and NATO camps in Yugoslavia. I mean, it's a natural place. People have money in hard times, go and get it. And the soldiers themselves feel exploited, and they are. And also, no great sense of community identification. After all, a transit camp is what it says. This is the place I'll be, and I'll be gone tomorrow, and damned if they'll catch me. And I don't have any loyalty to them. I'm not going to go on living here. My family's nowhere to be seen. I can get away with it, both sides.
Hundreds gathered to watch the destruction and looting at Tin Town. The men then raged through the camp itself, smashing canteens and officers' messes, looting the storerooms and YMCA buildings. Colonel Cahoon and many of his senior officers did not share the inadequacies of Kinmel Camp, but lived comfortably in nearby towns. A message was quickly sent to Cahoon's home in Rhyl. Desperate to avoid confrontation, Cahoon raced to Kinmel Park. As a young captain, he'd led 176 men off to war. Fewer than 10 were still alive. He ordered his officers to lock up all stocks of alcohol and empty every keg of beer. Then he mingled with soldiers looting the stores at Tin Town, trying to persuade them to disperse. Although they were polite enough, they continued looting. By early morning, patrolling provos had pounced on the groups of looters, clubbing them with billy sticks and locking them up. As the sun came up, the scene at the camp was one of devastation.
The next thing that Colquhoun did was to order that all ammunition be withdrawn from anywhere, wherever it was within the camp, and gathered together at the headquarters and put in a bunker, locked up securely, inaccessible to the rioters and to anybody else. Above all, what he didn't want was people shooting at one another.
On the morning of March the 5th, men gathered at the guardhouses to release the soldiers taken prisoner. Late in the morning, to ease the tension, Colonel Cahoon ordered all the prisoners be released. One of his officers, Lieutenant Colonel J.P. French, objected. He armed 50 men, distributed ammunition against orders, marched them to an adjoining camp, and ordered a wild bayonet charge into the crowd awaiting the release of their comrades.
In the event, there's no sign that they used any of their ammunition, but the bayonets they certainly used. They charged across the parade ground up to the crowd of soldiers. The precise circumstances under which two of the soldiers ended up being bayoneted are very difficult to determine. Nobody wants to talk in great detail about it. But in the melee, two things become clear. One is that Corporal Joseph Young was bayoneted in the face from one of the defending party, since we know that the rioters weren't using rifles and bayonets, and that we also know that another soldier Sapper William Terezovich from Grodno in eastern Russia received a bayonet stab in his stomach. French only won the day temporarily because the crowd was absolutely incensed by this. They swept forward, some of the weapons were seized from the defending party, and they carried the day, moving on further west into the area of camps 19 and 20. There was a great melee. Trying to describe the situation as they move across the camps somehow suggests that there's a kind of a wave of soldiers. It's not quite like that. They're moving across in a very uneven way. It's not consistent. It's certainly not organized.
I can imagine a camp where the officers in these 20 detached camps, each of them with, you know, almost 1,000 men in them, many of them, are scared out of their skivvies. I mean, they too don't want to be the last people killed in this war. Soldiers are wandering around in a drunken and angry and resentful state, and officers are among the people that they could target. So the officers, it seems to me, on the whole, make themselves scarce. I mean, one of the astonishing facts that the Court of Inquiry kind of passes by in embarrassment is why the officers did not do what King's regulations clearly required them to do, which is to use their very best efforts to suppress the mutiny. They clearly don't do that.
Most of the men in the camp tell their officers they would not act against their comrades, and the few who would demanded ammunition to protect themselves.
In the afternoon of March the 5th, 1919, there was a bunch of soldiers, about 2-3 dozen, marching along the road. They'd got a couple of billiard cues and they'd tied a bit of red curtain over the top of it. And one of them was playing a drum improvised from a biscuit tin. And they wheeled round and they swung their way in through the gate there. And they were marching up the hill. To the left of them, the open ground of Camp 18. To the right of them, the rows of huts of Camp 20, heading up in the direction of Camp 19 at the top of the camp. Now, what they were actually doing was just making a general protest, but there was more of a kind of clowning than there was communism about any of it.
The men who fought Lieutenant Colonel French to a draw after his bayonet charge heard that something was happening at the western end of the camp. There, newly commissioned Lieutenant J.A. Gautier was sending young soldiers like David Gillen out on snatch raids to arrest some of the demonstrators. The rioters were still enraged at the bayonet deaths of 2 men in the charge ordered by French. Colonel Cahoon, a brave, much decorated soldier, seemed strangely detached from the violence that was tearing his camp apart. If he knew men were being killed and wounded in the far reaches of Kinmel Park, he showed no sign of it. More were about to die, as other officers, like French with his bayonet charge, ran counter to Cahoon's direct orders. Word of the new arrests by Gautier drew hundreds of troops to an area of the camp containing units from Nova Scotia and Western Ontario, and the trench warfare training area. Lieutenant Gautier's men had ammunition. Where they got it from was never explained. As the demonstrating soldiers jeered, Gautier would send a squad racing out to seize any rioter who ventured too close to his lines. David Gillen was on such a squad when someone fired a shot. When Gillen's comrades saw him drop, the shooting began. Signaller William Haney and gunner Jack Heckman were killed. 6 others were wounded. Private Edmonston was the only rioter. The others were innocent bystanders.
David was in the heat of the battle with his officers defending the camp against the rioters, and however you view the reasons, and they had strong reasons from what I understand to riot, the tragic irony, almost satire of the situation is David fell in a trench in Wales, shot by a Canadian, having survived the Western Front. So he died in a trench anyway, but having been killed by his own, not by a German or someone fighting for the Kaiser. And our family has never been able to deal with this.
An enterprising local stringer, probably tipped off by a local working in the camp, filed the story to the newspapers. Whilst they got most of their facts wrong, they did accurately report the soldiers' major complaint. The army's first concern was to suppress news of the rioting, but the war was over, and newspaper editors had had enough of wartime censorship.
The first thing that happens in the camp is that order's restored by sending out squads and rounding up anybody who is seen as a troublemaker, either people who show visible evidence of having been involved in the trouble, or those that open their mouths too quickly and start boasting and kind of gilding things a bit. They get picked up and accused of mutiny and locked up. The next big tranche of people that are dealt with are those that are shipped out immediately. Nobody wants to hang around the camp anyway. The moment that the ship is announced as being available, hundreds, thousands of men are shipped out of the camp immediately, and that includes potential witnesses. So we have a situation in which there are, quote, troublemakers, people who are being accused of being responsible for the trouble, and you also have a large body of people who are now no longer there. And at the moment that those people get moved out of the camp, it becomes impossible to form a complete picture of what went on, and that's important, because it means that even the military themselves can't do that, had they wished to. My feeling is that they didn't wish to.
A military inquiry was quickly mounted. Colonels Cahoon and Thackeray got a mere rap on the knuckles. No officers were cited for disobeying Cahoon's orders concerning ammunition, and no attempt was made to discover how 5 Canadian soldiers died or who killed them. In the inquiry, one officer alleged that the riot had been instigated by American jailbirds, some Russians, other foreigners, and some excitable French Canadians.
Arthur Loa, the great Canadian historian, says that Canadian nationalism was born in the trenches of France and brought back to Canada in the knapsacks of the soldiers. And the soldiers, whether they be French-speaking or English-speaking or any other language, they had met guys they had been told to hate or to not to like, and they were dangerous and had persecuted them, and they died beside them. You know, they suffered astonishing atrocities. And they were then able, therefore, to cement, if not individual friendship, which I'm sure they did, but a higher regard for who these people were, as well as the guys who came from English-speaking Canada and who had been told that the French Canadians were cowards, they were peace supers, they were this and they were that. But they turned out to be brave men who fought their war with astonishing dignity and bravery.
2 days after the 5 men were killed, the local coroner, Frederick Llewellyn-Jones, convened an inquest. He received almost no cooperation from the Canadian Army. Potential witnesses were shipped to Canada. The only Canadians who appeared at the inquest were the officers linked with most, if not all, of the killings, Lieutenant Colonel French and Lieutenant Gautier. The coroner was denied access to evidence brought before the military inquiry. When the British Home Office told him the Canadian military was investigating the deaths and would charge those criminally liable, Llewellyn-Jones wound up his inquest. No one was ever charged.
The Canadians were clearly not overjoyed or eager to cooperate, nor were they prepared to hold back large numbers of potential witnesses. They wanted to clear the camp as soon as possible, and for pretty obvious reasons. The convenience of the court, either the military court, which also lacked witnesses, the courts martial going on in Liverpool, which lacked enormously witnesses for both sides, and of course the coroner's inquiry. These were not as important to the Canadian authorities as repatriating their men as fast as possible in the light of this catastrophe.
41 soldiers faced general court-martial for mutiny. 24 were found guilty and sentenced to prison terms of between 90 days and 10 years. The stench of injustice hung over the court-martial proceedings. One of those convicted was Roy Henley, an underage soldier. He had 2 wound stripes, had been gassed, and was one of the youngest Canadians at Vimy Ridge.
He was sentenced to 3 years, which was quite excessive. Then they dropped 2 years, and then they dropped all the charges, or dropped all the sentences after 6 months. I believe he was picked up downtown, not on the camp, not during the riot, and he was arrested. I don't think he believed for a moment that they'd ever be convicted of anything, because he felt he didn't do anything. Everybody was set free 6 months after, and they were honorably discharged. They suffered no disgrace on their records, which doesn't sound like, you know, the happenings of a court-martial.
Until the day he died many years later, Roy Henley tried in vain to clear his name.
For 75 years he tried, and that was his life's ambition, just to be totally guiltless. There was an injustice, and he felt it wasn't right what was done.
The men who died and lie in the graveyard at St. Margaret's were also victims of injustice, for no one ever sought to find those responsible. The military inquiry accepted an officer's evidence that the rioters opened fire the day David Gillen was shot, but the post-mortem reports show that Gillen was shot in the back. The bullet may even have been fired by one of his own men.
I think the closure, to the extent one can expect closure at this stage, would come from the medal and the official acknowledgement of David's death. If he died honorably, and all of the records show that he did, what was the reason not to say so? Well, of course, all of the rest of the political, to some extent economic, and perhaps the military hierarchy ruling, those complications shut the thing down.
Even today, the mystery of what really happened persists. Some locals say that all the Canadians buried here died in the riot, and whisper of a massive cover-up to hide the truth. Kinmel Park continues to haunt the Canadian Army. 50 years after the riot, the official Army historian sent questionnaires to the few surviving Kinmel Park veterans, seeking their version of events. It wouldn't have happened, one wrote, if the officers had only treated us like men.